The clang of the door to the kitchen echoed through the quiet restaurant, a sudden noise that made everyone at table 12 turn their heads. Emily Johnson, a waitress with a quiet demeanor and tired eyes, quickly adjusted her black apron, trying to hide her discomfort. She was used to this, used to being invisible, blending into the background, her presence only noticed when someone needed a glass of water or a refill of wine. But tonight, something felt different. She could feel it in the air. The laughter from the table of well-dressed men, the click of expensive heels, and the clinking of crystal glasses only heightened the tension she felt. She was used to being overlooked. It was safer that way. But tonight, the rich patrons weren't just ignoring her, they were mocking her. As she passed by, a low voice broke through the murmurs of conversation. "What's with the silent treatment, sweetheart? Cat got your tongue." Emily didn't flinch. She kept walking, ignoring the pointed stares and the hushed laughter. It had happened before, more times than she could count. They liked to think they could break her. That she was just another girl from nowhere. But what they didn't know, what they could never know, was that Emily wasn't just another quiet girl from the city. She was someone with a past, with stories of survival that wouldn't be shared over cocktails and whispered laughs. As she set the tray down in front of the table, a tall man in a sharp black suit caught her eye. His cold, calculating gaze locked onto hers. He wasn't like the others, he wasn't laughing. Instead, he seemed intrigued. His eyes were dark and intense, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She felt a flicker of something she didn't recognize. "You look like you have something to say," he remarked, his voice low, carrying a command she couldn't ignore. Emily's heart skipped. She didn't answer him. Her hands were steady as she placed the last glass on the table. But when she turned to walk away, something unexpected happened. A voice, soft and sharp, broke through the tension. It was her voice, clear, confident, and without a trace of hesitation. "Actually, I do." The words, "the perfect Italian," slipped from her lips like it was nothing. The room fell silent. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. The men at the table exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of confusion and curiosity. The tall man, Antonio Romano, as she would later learn, studied her with new interest, his lips curling into the slightest smile. He hadn't expected that. No one had. But it was too late. Now, Emily had their attention. And what they didn't know was that she wasn't just some quiet waitress, she was someone who had more to offer than they could ever imagine. Emily felt the weight of the silence pressing in on her as she moved away from the table, her heart still racing from the unexpected words that had slipped out so effortlessly. She had never intended to speak. She had never intended to show them this part of herself, the side of her that could speak perfect Italian, the side of her that wasn't just a waitress. But now it was done. The words had left her lips, and she couldn't take them back. The tall man, Antonio Romano, was still watching her, his gaze sharp and assessing. His eyes never left her, and despite the noise and chatter around them, she could feel the intensity of his stare. It was as if he could see right through her, as if he knew there was more to her than the quiet woman she appeared to be. She quickly made her way back to the kitchen, trying to shake off the feeling of being exposed. Her hands trembled slightly as she wiped down the counter, but her mind was racing. What had just happened? Why had she spoken? And why did it feel so right? Antonio Romano. She hadn't expected him to have such an impact on her, but there was something about him that unnerved her. He was different from the others. He wasn't like the rich men who came in and out of the restaurant, oblivious to the lives of the people serving them. Antonio seemed to notice everything, to pay attention to every detail. And it wasn't just his presence that was intimidating. It was the air around him, the authority, the power that radiated from him even as he stood still, barely moving. Emily tried to focus on her work, but she could feel his eyes on her, even from across the room. She couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking. Did he recognize her for what she truly was? Was he as intrigued by her as she was by him? A voice broke her thoughts, and she looked up to see Carmen, her fellow waitress, standing at the counter with a concerned look on her face. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked, her eyes darting over to where Antonio and his group were still seated. "You've been acting different. Is something going on?" Emily forced a smile, nodding quickly. "I'm fine, just tired," she replied, trying to brush off her unease. But Carmen wasn't convinced. "You sure?" she pressed. Emily didn't want to get into it, didn't want to explain why she felt like everything had changed in that one moment. "Yeah, I'm sure," she said, her voice firmer this time. Carmen raised an eyebrow but didn't push further. Emily turned back to the kitchen, her mind still on Antonio. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that somehow, their paths were going to cross again. She didn't know why, but something told her that Antonio Romano wasn't a man who would let someone slip away unnoticed. As the night went on, Emily tried to focus on her tasks, but she couldn't help but notice when Antonio stood up from his seat and walked toward her. His strides were confident, purposeful, and the way he moved through the crowd, effortlessly parting the sea of people, was almost mesmerizing. He stopped in front of her, his gaze never wavering. "I didn't expect you to speak," he said, his voice low and smooth, almost teasing. "You have a talent for keeping secrets." Emily swallowed hard, suddenly unsure of what to say. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not from someone like him. "I don't like to make a scene," she replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beat of her heart. Antonio smiled slightly, his eyes glinting with something unreadable. "Maybe you just haven't found the right audience," he said, his tone thoughtful. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. She didn't know what he meant by that, but somehow she felt like he was speaking to something deeper inside her, something she hadn't fully realized. Was there? Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, his presence lingering in the air like a magnetic force. Emily watched him go, her mind still racing. What had just happened? What was it about him that made her feel like she was teetering on the edge of something she couldn't understand? She wasn't sure, but one thing was clear: Antonio Romano wasn't like anyone she had ever met before. And he wasn't going to let her slip away that easily. The next few days felt like they moved in a blur for Emily. Every time she stepped into the restaurant, she couldn't shake the feeling that Antonio's gaze was on her, even if he wasn't physically present. She'd catch glimpses of him as he passed by in his sleek black car, or when his men showed up to grab a quick bite. It was like he was everywhere, watching, waiting. It was unsettling, and yet, there was a strange comfort in knowing that he had noticed her. He didn't make her feel small, like everyone else. He made her feel like she mattered, even if it was just for a moment. Her thoughts were interrupted when Carmen appeared, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What's going on with you? You've been different," she asked, her voice laced with concern. Emily forced a smile, trying to brush it off. "I'm just tired, that's all." But Carmen wasn't convinced. She had been her friend for too long to be fooled by a smile. "Is it because of him?" she asked, her gaze flicking toward the corner of the room where Antonio had just entered with a group of associates. Emily felt her heart skip a beat, and she quickly turned away, focusing on her work. "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to play it off, but Carmen's knowing expression made her realize it was pointless to pretend. "I've seen the way he looks at you," Carmen said quietly, leaning in. "And I saw you two talking the other night. He's not like the others." Emily couldn't deny it. There was something about Antonio that made her feel like she was standing at the edge of something life-changing. But she couldn't let herself think too much about it. She had a life to live, and it didn't include mafia bosses or whatever world Antonio came from. She didn't belong there. But despite her best efforts to push the thoughts away, they kept creeping back in. Antonio hadn't just noticed her, he had seen something in her. Something no one else had. He saw beyond the surface, beyond the quiet waitress who tried to hide in the background. And that terrified her. "He's dangerous, Emily," Carmen added softly. "You know that, right?" Emily didn't answer. She didn't know what to say. She wasn't afraid of Antonio, not in the way Carmen meant. It wasn't fear she felt when she was around him, it was something else. Something stronger. She wasn't sure if it was attraction or curiosity, but it was pulling her in, and it felt impossible to ignore. Later that evening, as Emily was clearing plates at the bar, she felt someone standing close behind her. She turned around, her breath catching in her throat when she saw Antonio standing there, his dark eyes fixed on hers. He was alone this time, no bodyguards, no entourage. Just him. He smiled slightly, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice low and steady. Emily opened her mouth to respond but hesitated. What was she supposed to say? "I thought I'd come by, see how you're doing," he continued, his gaze never leaving hers. There was something in his eyes, something unreadable, that made her pulse quicken. "I'm doing fine," she replied, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "Just working." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You're good at what you do," he said, his words more of a statement than a compliment. Emily didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to compliments, especially from someone like him. "Thanks," she finally said, feeling awkward under his gaze. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming in the small space behind the bar. "You're more than just a waitress, Emily," he said quietly. "I can see that." His words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Emily didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to respond to the fact that someone like him, someone so powerful, was paying attention to her. "You don't have to stay in this life, you know," Antonio continued, his tone almost gentle. "There's more waiting for you." Emily felt her heart race. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust the words coming out of his mouth, but a part of her couldn't. She couldn't risk everything she had built for a man like him. She had worked too hard, struggled too much to let anyone pull her into a world she didn't understand. "I'm not interested," she said firmly, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. Antonio studied her for a long moment, his eyes piercing, like he was weighing every word she said. Finally, he smiled again, that same small, knowing smile that made her insides twist. "We'll see about that." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emily standing there, her mind spinning with the implications of his words. She couldn't help but wonder, what did he see in her? And why couldn't she shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time they'd cross paths? Emily had never imagined a day where her routine would be so upended, where a single moment could cause a ripple that reached far beyond the walls of the restaurant. But here she was, standing behind the bar, feeling the weight of Antonio's words linger in the air. His promise, or rather, his challenge, had settled deep within her. He hadn't just spoken to her, he had seen something she wasn't sure she even knew was there. What did he mean by more waiting for you? Her life, her choices, had always been simple. Work hard, keep quiet, and get by. She had no desire for anything more than what she had fought so hard to maintain. But in the days that followed, Antonio's presence seemed to grow like a shadow that she couldn't shake off. He was still coming to the restaurant, but he no longer just sat in the corner with his associates. He started showing up at odd times, watching her, observing. The men he brought with him, always dressed in dark suits, would glance in her direction, but it was Antonio who always seemed to be the one to make eye contact. Those eyes. They were intense, almost predatory, but not in a way that felt threatening. Instead, they were calculating, measuring, and it made Emily feel like she was constantly being weighed, as though she was more than just a waitress to him. One evening, as she was walking through the restaurant with a tray of drinks, she found herself face to face with him. This time, there was no small talk. No playful comment. Just his gaze, steady and unyielding. "I need you to come with me," he said, his voice low, almost commanding. Emily stopped in her tracks. Her heart raced, but she wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, something she hadn't yet defined. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to sound composed. Antonio's lips curled into that small, knowing smile. "I have a job for you." Something that's better suited for someone like you." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Emily wondered if she could just walk away. But she didn't. Instead, she found herself nodding, unable to resist the pull of his presence. She followed him through the restaurant, past the murmuring crowd, and out into the cool night air. Antonio's car was waiting at the curb, its sleek black exterior gleaming under the streetlights. He opened the door for her, and without another word, she climbed in. The drive was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional glance he cast in her direction. When they finally arrived at a private building, something in her gut twisted. This wasn't a regular business meeting. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she couldn't ignore the fact that Antonio's world was unlike anything she had ever known. As they walked through the building's lobby, the sound of their footsteps echoed off the marble floors. Antonio led her into a room at the back, where a large desk sat under a crystal chandelier. A man in a suit stood by the window, his back to them. Antonio didn't introduce him, but it was clear this was someone important. "Sit," Antonio said, pointing to a chair across from the desk. Emily hesitated for just a moment before obeying. Her mind raced. What was going on? Why was she here? What did he want from her? The man at the desk turned to face them, his eyes flicking briefly to Emily before returning to Antonio. "She's the one?" the man asked, his tone skeptical. Antonio nodded. "She's the one," he repeated. Emily felt a chill run through her. The man didn't say anything more, just turned back to his papers, leaving Emily to wonder exactly what kind of game Antonio was playing. She didn't know what to do or how to act. This wasn't her world. She was out of her depth, and yet, for some reason, she couldn't turn away. She had to know more. She had to understand what Antonio was seeing in her. "You'll be fine," Antonio said, his voice surprisingly soft. "This is just the beginning." Just the beginning. Emily wasn't sure what he meant, but she couldn't deny the truth in his words. Somehow, she had already crossed a line. And there was no going back. The days after that meeting in the building felt like they were suspended in time. Emily couldn't stop replaying the encounter over and over in her mind. What was it about Antonio's world that made her feel both drawn to it and terrified by it? She had walked into that room expecting something ordinary, a simple conversation maybe, but instead, she had found herself caught in a web that was anything but simple. The office had been sleek and cold, like something out of a movie, and the man standing beside Antonio had barely acknowledged her presence. But it wasn't the atmosphere of the room that stuck with her, it was Antonio. His calm, confident demeanor had been both comforting and unnerving. She knew he was different, that much was clear from the moment their eyes met. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was always watching, always measuring, always expecting something from her. Over the next few days, Emily's routine continued, but she was no longer the same. The glances from the other staff members, the whispers behind her back, everything felt different now. Antonio's influence had seeped into her world, whether she liked it or not. He had opened a door, one she hadn't even known existed, and now she was standing at the threshold, unsure if she should step through or turn back. One evening, as she was finishing her shift, she found herself walking out to the parking lot, tired from a long day of work. She hadn't expected to see Antonio again so soon. But there he was, standing by his black car, leaning against it with that same calculated look in his eyes. "I thought you might need a ride," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. Emily stopped in her tracks. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, not wanting to appear vulnerable, but her heart was beating faster than usual. She had always prided herself on being independent, on not relying on anyone. But something about Antonio made that instinct fade into the background. "It's late. You shouldn't be out here alone," he added, his voice firm, as if it was more than just a suggestion. Emily hesitated for a moment, then sighed. There was something about him that made it hard to say no, even when she knew she should. She had never been one to take risks, but for some reason, she found herself walking toward his car. The ride was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Antonio didn't ask questions. He didn't try to fill the silence with empty chatter. Instead, he drove, his hand steady on the wheel, his eyes focused on the road. Emily found herself studying him from the corner of her eye. There was something magnetic about him, something that made her feel both safe and uneasy at the same time. "You're quiet tonight," he said after a while, glancing at her briefly. "What's on your mind?" Emily wasn't sure how to answer that. She had so many questions swirling in her mind, but she didn't feel like she could ask him. He was a man who operated in shadows, who controlled everything around him with a calm precision. She wasn't sure if he would even answer her questions honestly. "Just tired," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Antonio didn't press. Instead, he turned the car down a quiet street, slowing as they approached her apartment. "Here we are," he said softly, stopping the car in front of the building. Emily reached for the door handle, but Antonio stopped her. "I'll be around," he said quietly, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Don't forget that." She didn't know what to say. So, instead, she simply nodded and stepped out of the car. As she made her way to her door, her mind was racing. What was Antonio playing at? Why was he so persistent? And why, despite her better judgment, was she starting to feel like she couldn't avoid him? Emily couldn't shake the feeling that everything in her life was changing, but the strangest part was that she wasn't sure if it was for better or worse. Antonio's words, the promise in his eyes, lingered like a constant presence. He had already stepped into her world in ways she never expected, and now, it felt as if he was pulling her deeper into a reality she wasn't prepared for. She went about her days, going through the motions, but her thoughts kept drifting back to him. Every time she saw him in the restaurant, her heart would race, and every time their eyes met, it was as though a spark was lit. It was a connection that she couldn't deny, no matter how hard she tried to push it away. One evening, as she walked out of the restaurant, she found herself face to face with him again. Antonio was leaning against his car, looking as confident as ever. "I thought I'd see you again," he said, his voice low and smooth. Emily stopped in her tracks, unsure of how to respond. Part of her wanted to keep walking, to ignore him and continue on with her life. But another part, the part that had been pulling her toward him all along, couldn't resist. She had already crossed a line by even acknowledging him, and now it seemed like there was no turning back. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steady but her heart pounding. Antonio smiled, the corner of his lips curving just enough to show that he knew something she didn't. "What I want," he began, "is for you to stop running." His words hit her harder than she expected. She hadn't realized she was running. "I'm not running," she replied, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. Antonio's gaze softened, just for a moment, before he spoke again. "You are. You're running from everything you could be, everything you're capable of. You have more in you than you let anyone see." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had heard these words before, but never from someone like him. She wasn't used to people seeing her for what she could be, not what she was. She had always kept herself hidden, tucked away, blending in with the background. But Antonio, he made her feel like she could be something more. Something powerful. Something that didn't need to hide anymore. "I don't belong in your world," she said, trying to push him away, trying to ignore the pull she felt toward him. Antonio stepped closer, his presence overwhelming her. "That's where you're wrong," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You belong in my world more than anyone else." Emily's mind was racing. She had never been good at this, at letting someone else in, at trusting someone who had so much power. But there was something in Antonio's words, in the way he looked at her, that made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. "I don't know what you want from me," she whispered, feeling a knot form in her stomach. "I want you to stop fighting it," Antonio said, his voice almost a plea. "I want you to trust that I'm not asking for anything more than you, just the way you are." The sincerity in his voice shocked her. She had always believed that people like him wanted something from her, something she couldn't give. But now, hearing him speak so plainly, she wasn't so sure. "I don't know how to trust you," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Antonio reached out, his hand brushing hers gently. "You don't have to trust me yet," he said, his touch warm against her skin. "But I promise, you'll see in time." Emily looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but she couldn't deny that Antonio had already changed the course of her life. Whether she was ready or not, she was in his world now. And somehow, despite her doubts, it felt like the beginning of something she couldn't escape, no matter how hard she tried. The next few days felt like a blur, with Emily constantly finding herself caught between her normal life and the pull of Antonio's world. She had kept her distance, avoided any unnecessary encounters, but she couldn't ignore the way he had changed everything. He was always there, lingering just on the edge of her consciousness. She hadn't realized how much her world had shifted until she found herself staring at her reflection in the mirror one night, feeling like a stranger in her own skin. She wasn't the same person anymore. The quiet waitress who kept to herself, who stayed out of the spotlight, she was becoming someone else. Someone bolder, more willing to step into the unknown. She didn't know how Antonio had done it, but somehow, he had made her question everything. What did she really want from life? Was she content with fading into the background, or was there something more for her to claim? The question haunted her as she stepped into the restaurant the next evening. She had hoped for a normal shift, a quiet night where she could lose herself in the routine. But of course, that wasn't what she got. Antonio was there. Of course he was. This time, he was sitting at a corner table with a few associates, their conversation a mix of business and idle chatter. But when his eyes landed on her, everything else faded into the background. He wasn't just looking at her, he was watching her, really watching her, as if he could see through all her layers, all her defenses. "You're late," he said quietly as she passed by his table, his voice carrying just enough to make her pause. Emily didn't answer at first. She didn't know how. The words had been simple, but there was something in the way he said them, something that made her feel like she was in a game she didn't fully understand. She forced a smile and kept walking, hoping to push the unsettling feeling down. But as the night wore on, she couldn't help but feel the weight of his gaze on her. It wasn't just his attention that made her nervous, it was the way he made her feel like she was capable of more, that she was meant for something bigger than this. The night passed in a blur of clinking glasses and hushed conversations, but it was Antonio's presence that kept drawing her in. And then, as her shift came to an end, there he was again. Waiting for her by the door, looking as calm and collected as ever. "We need to talk," he said, his words simple but carrying a weight that made her stomach twist. She didn't respond. What was there to say? She had been avoiding this very moment, but somehow, she knew it was inevitable. She followed him out of the restaurant and into the cool night air, her mind racing with all the possible outcomes. The drive was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Antonio wasn't forcing conversation, he simply let the silence hang between them, like a thick fog that neither of them could escape. Finally, after what felt like hours, he spoke. "I don't want you to hide anymore." His words hit her like a wave crashing against the shore. She didn't know how to react. What did he mean by that? "Hide from what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Antonio glanced over at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Hide from who you really are. You're not just a waitress, Emily. You've been running from everything that you could be." The words stung. They weren't cruel, not in the way she expected, but they cut deep nonetheless. She had always been content with staying hidden, with keeping her head down and blending into the background. It had been easier that way. But now, Antonio's words made her question everything. "I don't know who I am," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Antonio didn't say anything for a long time, his gaze steady on the road ahead. Then, finally, he spoke. "That's because you haven't given yourself the chance to find out." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of his words. Emily didn't know what to say to that. She had never been one to take risks, to step outside her comfort zone. But something about Antonio, something about the way he looked at her, made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to her story than she had ever realized. When they arrived at her apartment, she stepped out of the car without a word, her mind swirling with thoughts of what he had said. As she walked up the steps to her door, she could still feel his presence lingering, like a shadow that refused to leave. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but one thing was certain, Antonio was right. She wasn't just a waitress. And it was time she stopped pretending she was. As she unlocked the door to her apartment, she felt the weight of the decision she had just made. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but she knew one thing for certain, she was no longer running from herself. The days after that night felt like a strange balance of uncertainty and excitement. Emily woke up every morning with a sense of anticipation, but also a nagging doubt she couldn't shake. Antonio had crossed a line, and so had she. She had never imagined herself stepping into a life so far removed from the one she had known. She had always played it safe, kept her distance from anything that might disrupt her world. But now, as she looked at herself in the mirror each day, she couldn't deny that something had changed. She wasn't the same person she used to be. She wasn't hiding anymore. At work, she was more present than ever. She still went through the motions, serving drinks and taking orders, but it felt different now. It felt like she was no longer just a part of the scenery. The customers, the staff, everyone seemed to notice her more. Even the way Antonio looked at her when he came in was different. He didn't just glance at her. He watched her, always with that unreadable look in his eyes. It was like he was waiting for her to make a move, to step further into the world he had been hinting at for so long. But Emily wasn't sure if she was ready for that. She wasn't sure if she could trust what she was feeling. Then one evening, as she was wiping down the counter, Antonio appeared by her side. He didn't say anything at first. He simply stood there, his presence as commanding as ever, his gaze fixed on her. She could feel the weight of his attention, and it made her heart race, but she forced herself to stay calm. "You've been avoiding me," he said finally, his voice low but steady. Emily didn't look at him. She kept her focus on the glass in her hand, trying to ignore the way his words sent a shiver down her spine. "I haven't been avoiding you," she replied, her voice steady, though she knew it wasn't true. Antonio raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "You're not good at hiding your feelings, Emily," he said, his tone gentle but knowing. Emily sighed, putting the glass down and meeting his eyes for the first time in days. She could see the challenge in them, the silent expectation that she would finally face whatever it was that was holding her back. "I'm just not sure," she admitted. Her voice quieter now. "I don't know if I can trust this." "Trust you?" Antonio didn't react right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his presence surrounding her in a way that felt both safe and dangerous. "You don't have to trust me," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "But you have to trust yourself." The words hit her harder than she expected. She had spent so much of her life hiding from the truth, hiding from herself, and now, in front of Antonio, it felt like she couldn't escape any longer. She had always been so careful, so guarded, but Antonio had a way of making her question everything. She had never wanted to be someone's pawn, never wanted to be controlled. But when he looked at her like that, with such certainty and calmness, she couldn't help but wonder if maybe there was something more to his world. Something she could be a part of. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Antonio reached out, his hand resting gently on her arm. "That's okay," he said, his voice reassuring. "You don't have to know everything right now. But I need you to understand this, you're not alone in this." His words were like a promise, and Emily couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as lost as she thought. Maybe this was just the beginning of something bigger than she could have ever imagined. As the night wore on, Emily found herself thinking about what Antonio had said. She wasn't sure if she was ready to dive into his world, but she knew one thing for certain, she couldn't keep running. The question now was whether she was ready to stop hiding and finally embrace whatever came next. Emily stood at the edge of something she couldn't fully comprehend. Each day felt like she was teetering on the brink of a decision, a choice that would change everything. Antonio had been patient, waiting for her to come to her own conclusions, but she could feel the clock ticking. He had made it clear, this wasn't a game to him. This was real. He wasn't asking her to follow him blindly, he was offering her a chance to be something more, something she had never allowed herself to be. But could she trust him? Could she trust herself? The question echoed in her mind, and she found it harder and harder to ignore. It wasn't just his presence that made everything feel different. It was the way he made her feel seen. Truly seen. For so long, Emily had hidden behind the walls she had built around herself, convinced that she was safer in the background. But Antonio had pulled her out of the shadows, and now, no matter how hard she tried to pretend, she couldn't unsee what was right in front of her. She had always thought she knew who she was, but now, she wasn't so sure. The quiet waitress with her unremarkable life wasn't the whole story. Antonio had awakened something in her, a part of her that had been dormant, waiting for the right moment to surface. She didn't know what this world would look like if she stepped into it, but she couldn't deny that it was calling her. That night, as the restaurant emptied out and the staff began cleaning up, Emily felt a shift in the air. The restaurant felt quieter than usual, the usual hum of activity replaced with a sense of anticipation. She glanced over at the door and saw Antonio standing there, watching her. His eyes locked onto hers, as if waiting for her to make the first move. She wasn't sure what had changed in her, but she knew that this moment felt different. "Are you ready?" Antonio asked, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of something deeper, something more intense. Emily took a deep breath. She wasn't ready in the way he might want her to be, but she knew she couldn't keep running from it. She nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was nodding for him or for herself. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the swirl of emotions inside her. Antonio smiled, that same small, knowing smile, as if he had been waiting for her to say those words. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He stepped aside, and she followed him out of the restaurant. The night air was cool, the city lights casting a soft glow on the pavement. They walked in silence, but the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It felt like an unspoken understanding, a recognition that they were both stepping into something new. Something unknown. When they reached his car, Antonio opened the door for her, and she slid inside without hesitation. The drive was smooth, the city fading behind them as they left the familiar streets behind. Emily felt a sense of calm settle over her, mixed with a nervous excitement she couldn't explain. She wasn't sure where this path would take her, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She had spent so much of her life holding back, afraid of what might happen if she let go. But with Antonio, everything felt different. There was no fear, only a sense of possibility. As they drove through the night, Emily realized that she wasn't just following him, she was following herself. And that realization was the most freeing thing she had ever felt. When they arrived at his place, Antonio didn't rush her. He simply led her inside, and for the first time in a long while, Emily felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew she was no longer standing on the edge. She was in it, living it, and there was no going back.